The dog who escaped death, and the man who saved him. The salty breeze drifted in through the open windows of James Carter's small beachside cottage. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocky shore was a familiar rhythm, one he had listened to for years. It was both comforting and at times unbearably lonely. James had lived in Seaview, a quiet coastal town, for nearly 3 decades. Once his house had been filled with laughter, the smell of fresh coffee in the mornings, and the soft hum of music playing from the old radio on the kitchen counter. But those days were long gone. His wife, Eleanor, had been his world. She had this way of making everything feel warmer, brighter. Even the stormiest nights seemed peaceful when she was around. But 5 years ago, cancer took her away, and ever since, life had felt empty, like an unfinished sentence. Their daughter, Anna, had moved to the city years ago, chasing her dreams in a world of skyscrapers and deadlines. She called when she could, visited when work allowed, but James never wanted to be a burden. "I'm fine," he always told her, "just enjoying the ocean." But the truth was, the silence in his house was deafening. James kept himself busy with simple routines. Every morning, he woke up at sunrise and walked to Captain Ray's Diner, the only cafe in town that still played old records. He'd order black coffee and buttered toast, always sitting by the window where he could watch the fishing boats heading out to sea. After breakfast, he'd stroll along the shore, collecting seashells, watching seagulls bicker over breadcrumbs, and listening to the distant chatter of tourists who came for weekend getaways. Back home, he spent his afternoons sketching marine life in an old leather notebook. The ocean fascinated him, always had. Before retiring, he had been a marine biologist, traveling to far-off places, studying sea creatures most people had never even heard of. Now he sketched out of habit, filling the pages with detailed drawings of whales, crabs, and jellyfish. It gave him a purpose, even if no one else ever saw them. As the sun set, he cooked simple meals, mostly soup or grilled fish, then sat on his porch staring at the waves. He liked to imagine Eleanor was still beside him, humming an old tune. But when he turned his head, there was only an empty chair. It was late October when the storm came. The sky had been painted in angry shades of gray since morning, and by nightfall, the wind howled through the town like a restless spirit. Rain hammered against the windows and thunder rumbled so loudly that James could feel it in his chest. He was about to turn in for the night when he heard it, a desperate, panicked barking. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but then it came again, louder this time, a sharp pleading sound, like someone calling for help. James stood by the window, squinting into the darkness. Lightning flashed across the sky, and that's when he saw it. A shadowy figure on a wooden platform behind the house next door. It was a dog, tied up with a thick chain to a wooden post. The chain looked old and rusted, barely holding against the animal's desperate struggle. The dog's fur was soaked, clinging to its thin frame. It was barking, pulling, yanking, fighting to break free, but no matter how hard it tried, the chain wouldn't budge. James felt his chest tighten. That house belonged to Greg Thompson, a fisherman known for his temper and his love for whiskey. James had seen the man before, always sitting alone at the bar, mumbling about how life had cheated him. He never smiled, never spoke kindly, and James had heard rumors about the way he treated his dog, but he had never seen it with his own eyes. Until now. Another flash of lightning, and the dog did something reckless. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, it leaped off the platform. James' breath caught in his throat. For a split second, there was only silence, just the sound of rain and wind. And then, the terrible truth became clear. The dog hadn't made it to the ground. The chain had caught around its neck, leaving it dangling in midair. James didn't think, he just acted. He grabbed his raincoat, yanked open the door, and ran into the storm. The wind nearly pushed him back, but he fought against it, his boots splashing through puddles as he sprinted toward the house. As he reached the fence, he could hear the dog choking, gasping, struggling to breathe. Its legs kicked weakly, its soaked body swinging from the chain. James's hands shook with anger. He climbed over the fence, ignoring the way his coat got snagged on the wooden planks. He had to get to that dog. He barely registered the sound of the front door slamming open. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" James turned to see Greg Thompson standing in the doorway, his eyes wild with fury. "That's my damn dog," Greg snarled, stepping onto the porch. He was swaying slightly, and James could smell the sharp bite of alcohol even through the rain. James's fists clenched. "That's not a dog. That's a dying animal, and you're the one killing it," Greg sneered. "What I do with my property ain't your business." James took a step forward. "That's not property. That's life." Greg let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You want to be a hero, old man? Go ahead, but don't think you can take him." James ignored him. He turned back to the dog, his mind racing. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before it was too late. He needed to get that dog down. But how?
The rain pounded against James' back as he stood beneath the swaying platform, his heart slamming against his ribs. The dog was barely moving now, its body swinging limply from the rusted chain, its legs kicking weakly in the air. James had to act fast. Greg Thompson stood on the porch, watching with a smirk, his arms crossed over his chest. His breath reeked of whiskey even from a distance. "You're wasting your time, old man," he slurred, shaking his head. "That mutt's nothing but trouble." James shot him a glare, barely containing his anger. How could anyone be so cruel? He had seen men with hard hearts before, fishermen who cursed the sea when it refused to give, men who let bitterness rot them from the inside. But this was different. James turned his focus back to the dog. It wasn't too late. The animal was still alive, still struggling, but not for much longer. His eyes darted around, searching for anything he could use. The wooden platform above him was about 10 feet high, too tall for him to reach the dog without help. The chain was looped around an old metal hook attached to a wooden post, and the wood was rotting. An idea sparked. James turned to Greg, his voice sharp and commanding despite the storm. "Where's your ladder?" Greg laughed, shaking his head. "Not my problem." James clenched his jaw, rain dripping from his soaked hair. He didn't have time for this. He turned toward the fence and called out, "Somebody! Help! I need a ladder!" For a few agonizing seconds, the only response was the wind and rain. Then from the shadows, a voice answered. "I've got one." A figure ran toward him through the storm, a young man, maybe 25, wearing a hooded jacket. Ethan, James realized. He had seen him around town before, working at the gas station. The kid was soaked, but his face was determined. Ethan swung a folded aluminum ladder over the fence. James caught it and quickly propped it against the side of the platform. "Hold it steady," he ordered. Ethan braced the bottom as James climbed, his hands slipping on the wet rungs, his muscles screaming in protest. He wasn't as strong as he used to be, but he had no choice. The closer he got to the dog, the more he could see its wide, terrified eyes, dark pools of fear. "It's okay, boy," James called over the rain. "I'm here now." The dog twitched at the sound of his voice, but it was too weak to fight anymore. Its limbs barely moved. James reached the top, balancing carefully on the narrow wooden beam. The platform groaned under his weight. He needed to hurry. The chain was twisted so tightly around the hook that James' fingers couldn't pry it loose. He cursed under his breath. "I need something to cut the chain!" Ethan called from below. "I think I have bolt cutters in my truck." "Hold on." James's hands tightened around the chain, trying to keep some of the weight off the dog's throat. The poor animal let out a soft, wheezing sound, its body shivering in the cold. "Stay with me, boy," James whispered. "Just a little longer." He looked down at Greg, who still stood motionless on the porch watching. "You're just going to stand there?" James snapped, his voice sharp. "This is your dog, for God's sake." Greg shrugged, his expression dull. "Ain't my problem anymore." Rage flared inside James. He wanted to climb down, drag the man into the mud, make him understand the pain he had caused. But there wasn't time. Ethan came running back, breathless. "Here, use these!" James caught the bolt cutters as Ethan tossed them up. He positioned the blades around the thickest part of the chain and squeezed with all his strength. His fingers ached, his grip slipping, but he forced the blades together. Snap. The chain broke. The dog collapsed into James's arms, completely limp. For a second, James thought he was too late. His breath caught. Then a faint, shuddering breath came from the animal's chest. "He's alive!" James shouted, relief flooding his voice. He carefully climbed down, his arms wrapped around the dog's thin, wet body. As soon as his boots hit the ground, he rushed toward the fence. "Ethan, open my truck," he ordered. "We need to get him warm." Ethan sprinted ahead, yanking open the door of James's old pickup truck. James laid the dog on the seat, wrapping his coat around the frail, trembling creature. The dog's eyes fluttered open slightly, looking up at him with a mix of fear and confusion. "You're safe now," James murmured. "I promise." Just as James shut the truck door, the flash of red and blue lights filled the night. A police car pulled up, splashing water as it braked near the house. 2 officers climbed out, their faces grim. "Who called it in?" one of them asked. James turned, his expression hard. He motioned toward Greg, who was still standing on the porch, arms crossed, looking mildly irritated but not at all remorseful. "That man left his dog to die," James said, his voice edged with anger. "I had to cut him down myself." The officer nodded, then turned to Greg. "Sir, we need to speak with you." Greg rolled his eyes but stepped forward. "Oh, come on, it's just a dog." James took a step forward, fury burning in his chest. "You don't deserve to own anything living." The officer held up a hand to keep James from getting closer. "Sir, we'll handle this." Ethan placed a hand on James's shoulder. "Come on, let's get the dog to the vet." James hesitated, still staring at Greg, but then the dog whimpered softly, as if reminding James that he needed him more. James turned away and climbed into the truck. As he started the engine, he glanced down at the dog, curled up on the seat, barely moving. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he murmured. The dog's tail gave a weak, single wag. James felt something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, saving this dog was exactly what he needed to save himself. The old truck rumbled through the empty streets of Seaview, its headlights cutting through the misty rain. James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Beside him, the injured dog lay motionless, wrapped in James's soaked jacket. The only sound was the rattling of the truck and the dog's weak breathing. James stole a glance at him. The retriever mix was thin, far too thin, his ribs pressing against his damp fur. His legs were scraped and bruised, and his neck bore deep indentations where the rusty chain had cut into him. James clenched his jaw. Greg Thompson deserved worse than a fine. He turned his focus back to the road, the distant glow of Dr. Whitmore's veterinary clinic appearing through the rain. James parked in front of the clinic, hurried out, and gently scooped the dog into his arms. "Hold on, buddy," he whispered, "just a little longer." The bell jingled as James pushed open the door. The inside was warm, filled with the faint scent of antiseptic and lavender. Dr. Emily Whitmore, a kind-faced woman in her late 40s, looked up from the front desk. She took one look at the dog in James' arms and rushed forward. "Oh my God, bring him here." James laid the dog on the examination table, and Emily immediately went to work. She checked the dog's breathing, ran her fingers along his ribs, and examined the wounds on his neck. The entire time, James stood by, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his heart pounding. Is he going to make it? His voice was hoarse. Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed her stethoscope against the dog's chest and listened for a long moment. Then she sighed. "He's weak, malnourished, and dehydrated, but he's a fighter. I think he has a chance." James exhaled sharply, relief washing over him. Emily cleaned the dog's wounds and started an IV drip, explaining, "He needs fluids and warmth. I'll keep him here overnight and monitor him." James nodded. "Do whatever you need to. I'll cover the cost." Emily gave him a knowing look. "You sure? You don't even know this dog." James met her gaze. "I do now." The next morning, James returned to the clinic before the sun had even risen. He found the dog resting in a soft bed, hooked up to an IV. His breathing was steadier, though his body was still frail. Emily smiled as she approached. "He's stable. He woke up a few times, but he's still weak. He's going to need a lot of care." James stared down at the dog, something in his chest tightening. "What happens now?" he asked. Emily hesitated. "Normally, we'd contact the local shelter and find a foster, but considering what he's been through, he needs someone who's patient." James's heart beat a little faster. The idea had already been forming in his mind, but now it was real. "I'll take him," he said. Emily blinked. "You sure?" James nodded. I can't just let him go to some stranger. He needs time, and I have plenty of that. Emily studied him for a long moment, then smiled. All right, James, he's yours. James looked down at the dog and for the first time said, Let's get you home, buddy. Back at home, James laid out a soft blanket by the fireplace and set a bowl of fresh water nearby. He had no idea what the dog liked to eat, so he had picked up a few different kinds of food from the pet store. The dog lay curled on the blanket, staring blankly at the flickering fire. He barely moved. He wasn't aggressive, just afraid. James sat down on the floor a few feet away. No sudden movements, no loud noises. Don't worry, he murmured. You're safe now. The dog didn't react. James knew this wasn't going to be easy. The first few days were tough. The dog refused to eat at first, only sniffing the food before turning away. He flinched at sudden movements. When James tried to pet him, the dog cowered, shrinking into himself. It broke James's heart, but he refused to give up. Every morning, James sat near him, reading aloud from his old marine biology books. He left food near him, but never forced him to eat. He gave him space, letting the dog set the pace. By the 5th day, the dog ate his first full meal. By the 7th day, he let James gently touch his head. And by the 10th day, when James sat on the porch in the evening, the dog cautiously walked over and sat beside him. James didn't speak, didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the ocean. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. One morning, as James poured himself coffee, he heard something. A soft thud. He turned to see the dog nudging his sketchbook with his nose, flipping the pages with his paw. James chuckled. You like that? The dog looked up at him with dark, curious eyes. James flipped to an old drawing of a shadowy figure swimming beneath the waves, a killer whale. You remind me of him, James mused. You don't say much, but you're still here. You keep going. The dog's tail gave a small wag. James Smado. The dog blinked. Shadow, James said again, testing the name. Yeah, that suits you. The dog didn't flinch, didn't look afraid anymore. For the first time, James reached out without hesitation and scratched behind Shadow's ears. And this time, Shadow leaned into his touch. Days turned into weeks, and Shadow slowly came to trust James. He followed James on his morning walks. He lay beside him when James sketched. He even curled up at the foot of James' bed at night. He still had scars, both inside and out. Loud noises made him tremble. Sudden movements made him flinch. But James was patient. Every night as they sat by the fireplace, James would whisper, You're safe now. And one night, Shadow licked his hand. James smiled. Yeah, buddy, I think so too. But peace never lasts forever. One night as James and Shadow sat on the porch, the wind carried a sound that made James' blood run cold. The slow crunch of footsteps on gravel. James looked up and his stomach dropped. Standing at the edge of the yard was Greg Thompson, and he was staring right at Shadow. The night air was heavy with the scent of salt and damp earth. The wind rustled through the palm trees, making them sway like silent sentinels watching over the sleepy town of Seaview. James sat on his porch, the soft glow of the porch light casting long shadows across the worn wooden planks. Shadow lay beside him, curled up with his nose tucked beneath his paw. The dog's fur had grown shinier, healthier. His ribs weren't as visible anymore, and his once dull eyes now held a quiet intelligence. James took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth against the chilly night. But then, he heard it. A slow crunching sound. Footsteps. James's muscles tensed. Shadow's ears twitched, his body going rigid before he even lifted his head. James turned his gaze toward the gravel driveway, and his stomach sank like a stone in deep water. Greg Thompson stood there. Greg's figure was bathed in the dim light, his face partly hidden by shadows, but James could still make out the cold gleam in his eyes. He swayed slightly, drunk, just like the last time James had seen him. Shadow let out a low, warning growl. Greg chuckled, taking a slow step forward. Well, ain't this a cozy little picture? Just you and my dog. James stood up slowly, keeping his hands loose by his sides. He wasn't a fighter anymore, not in the way he had been in his youth, but that didn't mean he wouldn't defend what was his. He's not yours, James said, his voice calm but firm. Not anymore. Greg scoffed. You think a piece of paper changes that? He's mine. Always has been. Shadow's growl deepened. A warning. James' pulse pounded. The last thing he wanted was for Shadow to get hurt again. "You need to leave," James said. "You're trespassing." Greg smirked and took another step forward. "You think I care about that?" He jabbed a finger towards Shadow. "I trained that mutt. He knows who his real master is." James clenched his fists. "His real master? The man who left him to die?" "You don't own him anymore," James said, his voice colder now. "And if you don't leave, I'll call the sheriff." Greg let out a slow, mocking laugh. "Go ahead, call him. You think the law cares about an old man and his rescue dog?" Shadow stood up then, his body low to the ground, his teeth bared. Not out of fear, but out of courage. James had never seen him like this before. Greg took another step, and Shadow let out a deep, guttural bark. It was not the sound of a scared dog. It was the sound of a survivor standing his ground. Greg hesitated. For the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his expression. Doubt. James took a step closer. "You should leave," he said again, his voice steel. Greg's lip curled. "This ain't over, Carter," he muttered. But he took a step back, then another. Finally, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. James didn't move until he could no longer hear the sound of crunching gravel. Then he looked down at Shadow. The dog's chest was heaving, his tail stiff, his muscles still coiled like a spring. James knelt down, placing a steadying hand on Shadow's back. "It's okay, boy," he murmured. "He's gone." Shadow whined softly, nudging James's knee as if making sure he was okay too. James smiled, rubbing behind the dog's ear. "You're braver than I am." For the first time since the night Shadow had been rescued, James truly felt like they were a team. The next morning, James woke up feeling uneasy. Greg had walked away last night, but that didn't mean he was done. James had seen men like him before, men who couldn't stand losing, men who let anger and pride eat them up inside. James couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was waiting. And he was right. Later that day, as James was fixing the fence in his backyard, Sheriff Tom Braddock pulled into the driveway. The sheriff, a burly man with kind eyes, stepped out of his truck and adjusted his belt. James wiped his hands on his jeans. "Morning, Tom," Braddock sighed, tipping his hat. "Wish I was here under better circumstances." James's stomach sank. He already knew what was coming. "Let me guess," he said. "Greg filed a complaint." Braddock nodded. "Says you stole his dog." James let out a sharp laugh. "That dog was dying when I found him. The law ruled in my favor." Braddock sighed. "I know, James, and personally, I'd throw Greg in jail if I had the chance. But he's got a lawyer now, and he's pushing for a court hearing." James clenched his jaw. "A court hearing? Greg was really that desperate, huh?" Braddock rubbed his chin. "You got all your paperwork in order?" James nodded. "Adoption papers, vet records, everything." Braddock gave a slow nod. "Then you shouldn't have anything to worry about. But just keep an eye out." James frowned. "You think Greg'll try something?" Braddock exhaled. "I don't think Greg's the type to take no for an answer." James looked over at Shadow, who was watching them from the porch. His dark eyes were steady, as if he knew something was coming. "I'll be ready," James murmured. That night, it happened. James had just finished locking up the house when Shadow's barking shattered the silence. James's heart leapt as he rushed to the back door. He threw it open just in time to see a shadowy figure near the fence. Greg. James barely had time to react before Greg lunged forward, shoving him hard. James stumbled back, hitting the porch railing. Greg was wild-eyed, furious. "You think you can take what's mine?" he snarled. Shadow exploded into action. With a deep, ferocious snarl, Shadow charged, sinking his teeth into Greg's wrist. Greg howled in pain, stumbling backward. "Call him off," he shouted. James didn't move. Shadow didn't either. He stood his ground, his fur bristling, his tail raised high. Greg clutched his bleeding wrist, his eyes wide with fear. "Leave," James said, his voice dangerously calm. "Or next time, he won't stop." Greg hesitated, then turned and ran into the night. James exhaled, his hands still shaking. Then he looked down at Shadow. For the first time, Shadow wasn't trembling. For the first time, he stood strong, confident, unafraid. James knelt down, brushing a hand through his fur. "You saved me," he murmured. Shadow nudged his shoulder. James let out a soft chuckle. "Yeah, I guess we saved each other." And in that moment, James knew one thing for sure. Shadow wasn't just his dog, he was his family. The sun rose slowly over Seaview, casting a golden glow over the ocean. The waves lapped gently against the shore, and the salty air carried the distant sound of gulls calling out to one another. But inside James Carter's house, the world was anything but peaceful. He sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Shadow lay beside him, his dark eyes watching James closely, as if sensing the storm brewing in his mind. Last night had changed everything. Greg Thompson had attacked him, right here in his own backyard. And Shadow, the same dog who had once been too scared to even lift his head, had fought back. James reached down, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "You saved my life, buddy," he murmured. Shadow thumped his tail against the floor, nudging James's hand with his nose. It was a silent reassurance. But James' mind was elsewhere. He knew Greg wasn't done. Men like him never gave up so easily. He had two choices: wait for Greg to strike again, or end this once and for all. James took a deep breath, grabbed his jacket, and picked up his car keys. "We're going to town," he told Shadow. "It's time to settle this." A week later, James found himself sitting inside the Seaview County Courthouse. The room smelled like old books and polished wood, and the air was heavy with tension. On the opposite side of the courtroom, Greg Thompson sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his wrists still bandaged from Shadow's bite. His lawyer, a thin man with greasy hair, leaned in, whispering something to him. Greg's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't speak. James sat up a little straighter as the judge entered the courtroom, his robes swishing as he took his seat. "All rise," the bailiff announced. James glanced at Shadow, who was waiting patiently outside with Ethan, the young man who had helped save him that stormy night. James had convinced the judge to allow Ethan as a witness. The case began with Greg's lawyer standing up, clearing his throat. "My client," he said smoothly, "is simply trying to reclaim what is rightfully his. This dog, originally in my client's care, was unlawfully taken. Mr. Carter had no right to remove him." James felt his blood boil. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked toward James. "Mr. Carter, how do you respond?" James stood. His voice was steady. "Your Honor, I didn't take Shadow. I saved him. That man left him to die, hanging from a chain. I have vet records proving the extent of his injuries, and I have witnesses who saw what happened." Ethan nodded from the bench. "I was there, Your Honor. Mr. Carter risked his own life to save Shadow." The judge turned to Greg. "Mr. Thompson, do you have any proof that the dog was being properly cared for?" Greg shifted in his seat. His lawyer coughed awkwardly. "No, Your Honor," Greg muttered. The judge leaned back in his chair. For a long moment there was silence. Then he sighed. "The law is clear," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Carter followed the correct procedures to adopt the dog legally. Shadow is no longer your property, Mr. Thompson." Greg's jaw tightened. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Greg simply shoved his chair back and stood. "You got lucky, old man," he hissed at James. James didn't flinch. He just stared Greg down. "This was never about luck," James said quietly. "It was about doing the right thing." Greg stormed out of the courtroom, shoving the doors open so hard they banged against the walls. The judge rapped his gavel. Case closed. James let out a long, slow breath. It was finally over. When James stepped out of the courthouse, Shadow was waiting for him, sitting patiently beside Ethan. As soon as Shadow saw James, his tail wagged excitedly. James smiled. "Guess what, boy? You're mine. For good." Shadow let out a happy bark, jumping up to place his paws against James' chest. James laughed, rubbing his head. Ethan grinned. "You did it, James." James nodded. But deep down, he knew Shadow had done it too. With the court case behind them, James and Shadow settled into a life that finally felt right. No more looking over their shoulders, no more fear, just peace. Shadow was a different dog now. He played more, chasing the waves on their morning beach walks. He was more confident, no longer flinching at every sound. He still had his scars, but he carried them with strength, not fear. And James? For the first time in years, he wasn't lonely. His house, once so silent, now echoed with the sound of Shadow's paws padding across the floor. His days weren't just empty routines anymore. They were filled with small, unexpected joys. One afternoon, as James sat sketching by the window, Shadow padded over and rested his head on James's knee. James smiled down at him. "You really aren't going anywhere, are you?" Shadow wagged his tail, his eyes filled with pure trust. James chuckled. "Good, because I wasn't planning on letting you go." And for the first time in a long, long time, James felt like he had found his purpose again. A few months later, on a bright spring afternoon, James was tending to his rose garden when he heard a car pull up. He turned, squinting against the sun. A familiar face stepped out. Anna, his daughter. James's breath caught. It had been nearly a year since she had last visited. "Dad," she said, smiling as she walked toward him. "I had some time off and thought I'd come by." James wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to hide his surprise. "Well, this is a nice surprise." Shadow, curious about the new visitor, trotted up beside James, watching Anna carefully. Anna's eyes widened. "Wait, is this the dog I read about? The one from the newspaper?" James chuckled. "Yep, Anna, meet Shadow." Shadow sniffed her cautiously before wagging his tail. Anna knelt down, scratching behind his ears. "He's beautiful," she murmured. James watched as his daughter laughed softly, running her fingers through Shadow's fur. For the first time in years, she was here. He felt his chest tighten. Maybe, just maybe, Shadow wasn't the only thing he had saved. That evening, James and Anna sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Shadow lay at James's feet, content. Anna sipped her tea. "You seem different, Dad." James glanced down at Shadow, then back at his daughter. He smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I think I finally found what I was missing." Anna reached over and squeezed his hand. And as the last light of the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, James finally felt whole again. Because sometimes the ones we save end up saving us right back.